Welcome to Rattling the Bars. I'm Eddie Conway. For the past 6 weeks, activists, advocates, and formerly incarcerated individuals have been responding to New York Board of Parole's new draft guidelines. The new draft include language about basing parole decisions on risk and need assessment. Governor Andrew Cuomo says the new guidelines could help increase, quote, transparency, fairness, and accountability. To discuss this, we are joined by Laura Whitehorn. Laura Whitehorn is an organizer with the RAP, or Release Aging People in Prison campaign. She spent 14 years in prison and was released in 1999. Laura, this week, the deadline to submit comments on the new regulations, your organization, RAP, submitted a statement of its own, which offered both praise and critique. Let's start with the praise, and how could these new guidelines help your constituency? Elderly, incarcerated people, a population that is rapidly increasing.
Well, what's good about the regulations is that they finally put risk and needs assessments at the top of the requirements for someone to be released on parole. In other words, they mention as not just another factor, but as a sort of a guiding principle, the use of assessments that show if someone is a good risk for release. In other words, if right now, not when they committed their offense 40 years ago, but right now, they are going to abide by the law and contribute to society and live a productive life.
Okay, and so what's your criticism of the guidelines, though?
Our criticism is that it doesn't do that strongly enough. So we want them to take risk and needs and make it the overriding, the thing that if you meet the risk and needs assessment, you are presumed to be released unless some very good current issue is raised by the board. In other words, they can't go back to what you did when you were 19 years old, and now it's 44 years later. We want them to say that if they deviate from the risk and needs assessment of a person, they have to give a reason other than something connected with the nature of the original offense. We also think that they have to look at everyone, not just the people who are actually eligible for parole, but people whose sentences are too long or for some reason they're not eligible for parole yet, but they're over the age of 50 or 60. We want them to give those people a shot at release as well. We feel that the regulations have to be much stronger because a lot of the parole commissioners are loath to follow risk and needs assessments, and they want to just go back over and over again to the nature of the person's offense rather than what has that person done in 44 years behind bars, 48 years behind bars, and who are they now?
Okay, let's get some background. The elderly population in prisons has been soaring. I think in 2012, the ACLU had a report that showed a 1,300% increase in prisoners the age of 55 and over since the early 1980s. Talk to us about how we got to this point. Is this the result of a general increase in incarceration, or did specific minimum sentencing or parole-related policies result in this increase?
All of the above. In New York State, let me be specific about New York State because that's where RAP is located. And Mujahid Fareed, who's the lead organizer of RAP, did 33 years on a 15 to life sentence in New York State, so he's typical. And in New York State, the overall population in the prisons fell slightly, although overall in the country it's still increasing. But in New York State, it fell slightly since 2002 because of an adjustment in the drug laws. So in general, politicians were looking at ways to decrease the prison population. However, the longer sentences that people were getting in the last 20 or 30 years because of things like, quote, truth in sentencing, and because of the let's be hard on crime rhetoric of politicians, means that a lot of people have longer and longer sentences. And that is creating an older population. In addition, there's very little compassionate release. In New York State, there's so few people get out on compassionate release. And mainly, the parole board does not release people. So the percentages of people over the age of 50 who have the lowest recidivism rate of any part of the population are the same as everyone else in New York State, and they're under 30%. As a result, and people are aging. So the younger people are getting longer sentences, and they're staying in prison longer, and then the parole board won't release them. In many states, there is no parole, and so people are just stuck there. Pennsylvania, life without parole. Everywhere, life without parole is going into effect. It's the permanent punishment disease of this country that takes people of color and says they never get a second chance, that is creating this bloated over 50 prison population.
Well, the new New York Parole Board draft regulations followed the suicide of the 70-year-old John McKesson in August. McKesson was in prison for like 40 years and was eligible for parole for 16 years. Did the response to his death and the outcry in New York have any impact on the new proposed regulations?
Well, I think it did. And we have on our website, rapcampaign.com, people have sent us copies of their comments on the regulations, and we have over 200 already. And we've heard from the state that they've gotten 400 or more comments on the parole regulations, and I think that is a response. John McKenzie was a person that the courts, in an appeal of his parole denial last year, a court said if there was ever a candidate for parole, this man is it. If he doesn't get out, is there such a thing as parole? They held the parole board in contempt for not releasing him. He'd gone 9 times. After that contempt ruling, he went back again and was denied for a 10th time, again based on the nature of the crime, for which he had taken full responsibility. And it was such an outrage that they had driven him to this, that people around the state gathered in Albany and in New York City for demonstrations, and there was an outcry of how can this be going on? How can someone who has achieved so much, has transformed his life, has more a sense of social responsibility than the average person walking down the street, how can he be denied and kept locked up? So I think that we are seeing this, and this is why the parole board even started to issue their new regulations. We know this because they said that. They said there's been an outcry from the community. The governor would never have said anything about the parole, the low rate of release on parole, if it hadn't been for huge community outcry.
Okay, in related news, at the beginning of November, the U.S. Sentence Commission approved changes to the federal sentencing guideline that took effect, which include broadening the criteria for compassionate release. What effect could these new guidelines have on the aging prison population? Does it create any binding change also?
Yeah, if they're followed, they could, because the language in some of those new regulations says things like if you have a condition which is chronic and which is related to aging and which will not stop, it's going to continue to get worse, and it cannot be managed in a correctional setting, that is a grounds for release. And it used to be that the Federal Bureau of Prisons would only let people out if they had, and a doctor had to certify this, 18 months or less to live. And even then, most people got turned down. There was something like 24 people let out in 1 year recently, which is ridiculous given the number of federal prisoners, which is something like over 800,000. So we have a situation where people who are ill and dying are not being released. If the other states would follow that, it would be a very good thing. It would mean that people would be able to spend in dignity their latter years in their community and with their families. But as it is, we have people in New York State. We have a political prisoner, Robert Setpace, who has horrible diabetes that is unmanageable in a correctional setting, and he should definitely be released.
Mhm. Well, numerous recent reports have highlighted the cost of growing elderly prison populations in terms of the need for medicine, and it's not necessarily all the time like critical conditions. Like people, as they age, they have various things that need to be taken care of, they need to be looked at, and so this apparently is costing a lot of money for the prison system itself. Do you think this cost in and of itself helps in any way support the argument that elderly people, prisoners, should be released?
Well, it certainly does. I mean, there are estimates that a person over the age of 50 or 55 costs the correctional departments between 2 and 4 times what a younger person's medical and other expenses cost. And that's partly because of the need of the administrative use of security, so that, as you know, when you're taken out of a prison to get medical care, 2 or 3 correctional officers come with you, and they're armed and they're getting overtime. So it's costing more than it would in the community. We feel like the reason that there's any attention to the issue of aging in prison is because politicians were moved by these budgetary concerns. That's why there started to be articles about 5 or 6 years ago around the country showing the number of aging people in prison. And that was the point at which RAP said, well, let's not look for more money. Let's not retrofit prisons to be nursing homes. Let's not create hospices. Let's release people because they don't pose a threat to security. And I'm not just talking about the ones who are ill and debilitated. I'm talking the ones who are mature and can contribute and be experts on the prison system and how to fix it now. So the costs are one thing. The cost socially and morally to our society is even greater.
Mhm. Well, now, President-elect Donald Trump has called many times, as we all know, for a tough-on-crime policy. And many have speculated that the former New York Mayor, Rudy Giuliani, who's probably among the closest people that will be in Trump's administration, Giuliani was obviously the zero tolerance person in New York. He was also known for his use of the broken window police strategy that locked up people willy-nilly, especially people of color, randomly. So do you think that Trump's coming administration will have any effect on the workings of parole boards, not just in New York, but around the country?
I'm afraid it will. You know, Rudy Giuliani, when he was the mayor, the police, when they beat people and when they sodomized Abner Louima, used to say it's Giuliani time. And I think that what we have to, the only bright spot in all of this is that I think the resistance will be clearer. And I think that we're hoping that some liberal and democratic politicians will try to distinguish themselves by keeping their states sane on some policies and maybe making the reforms that they've been talking about. I would hope that in the next few months that President Obama would see that the issue of aging people in prison is going to get worse, and that he will use his executive clemency powers to free Leonard Peltier, Veranza Bowers, Mutulu Shakur, and Oscar Lopez, the people who are political prisoners and who are elders, especially Leonard Peltier is older than I am. He's 72, I think. And if President Obama doesn't move on these, and also if he doesn't grant clemency and release to Chelsea Manning, then he will be condemning these people to horrible, torturous deaths within the correctional system. I think that everyone has to stand up and try to say the decent thing and the right thing is to fight back and to continue to protest and to continue to push for every parole commissioner, every politician in the country who is to the left of Attila the Hun, aka Donald Trump, to take a stand and do what's right and to try to act morally and stop looking at election returns and start looking at building a decent society that could have some hope of justice.
Well, you know, I heard you say earlier that RAP was located in New York, but I'm aware that there's like RAP chapters in other states. Are they still operational?
I'm glad you asked that. You kept me from getting in trouble and also from naming our two most effective and active chapters in Baltimore, Maryland, and in Washington, D.C. In Washington, D.C., there are a lot of students working with RAP. In Maryland, we have a lot of long-termers, some people who got out on the Unger decision and some who got out other ways and are elders who are working with people who are still incarcerated. And the DC chapter in particular is working on the human rights platform for RAP. We're also beginning to have a chapter in New Jersey, in Newark, New Jersey. So we're hoping that it's going to spread across the country. We have activists who are doing similar work in Albany, and RAP New York City is active around the state.
Mm-hmm. So how can people get information in relationship to your organization if they want to help or support it?
Well, we want them to. They can go to rapcampaign.com. That's RAPP campaign.com, and all the information, including contact information, is there. There's a petition that people can sign, and they can call us or email us. They can come to our meetings, and the information for Maryland and DC RAP are also there on the page that's called About.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you for joining me.
Thanks, Eddie. And you are one of our most leading elders who was released from prison, so you make a good example for us.
Okay, thank you. And thank you for joining Rattling the Bars.